Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, North Korea, the G7 and Iran. Our guest, Sarah Sloan, National Staff Coordinator of the Answer Coalition. Sarah Sloan, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sarah, the President Trump said, and I quote, "I don't think I have to prepare much for this summit with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. It's about attitude. It's about willingness to get things done." Your reaction?
Well, unfortunately, as is common, Trump is, sort of not giving these incredibly significant issues of sort of peace and the future of the world the weight they deserve. But in a sense, if Trump has decided that he's committed to moving forward on what so many U.S. administrations have sort of started and not followed through on, then in a way it isn't that complicated. North Korea has made it very clear what they need. They need a peace treaty. They need an end to sanctions. They need the U.S. and South Korea to make a commitment to the denuclearization of the peninsula and be allowed to work with all Koreans to move towards reunification. So hopefully that is what he means, and that there will be solid moves in that direction, since clearly that is what the North and the South and all Koreans are committed to.
And what do you think that they're going to accomplish in this meeting? Is it going to take place? Because you know that things could change from a second to the next.
You absolutely don't know with Trump, and there also is significant opposition within the Trump administration and the U.S. ruling elites to this. Trump actually appears to be more committed to moving forward with North Korea towards peace than some others in his administration and the Pentagon. So it's possible also they could continue to throw up roadblocks. And unfortunately, several U.S. administrations have made various agreements with the North and the South and other parties and then failed to follow through. So that's the big danger, as just sort of the commonplace danger of Trump zigzagging either which way. But we do hope, especially sort of given how much advancement there's been between the North and the South, that there's enough pressure on the Trump administration to force the U.S. to move forward towards peace, since that is clearly what the people of Korea and the rest of Asia desire.
You were mentioning the divisions within the Trump's government. And for example, what we have learned is that, for example, that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, is very skeptical of the results, and they're pro-meeting, pro-summit. We're talking about Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and also the Secretary of Defense, John Mattis. So, but all of them, except at least John Mattis, because we're talking about military, all of them, they have the reputation of being just hawks. So they're not really the reputation of pushing for peace.
Absolutely, and while we know John Bolton has had his eye in North Korea going way back, he had identified in the aftermath of September 11th and been part of the Bush administration and their Bush's and then Bolton's support for the identity of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the axis of evil. So he certainly has been very focused on North Korea for a long time. And we know that what Mattis has done and what others have done is try to set up roadblocks that will force the negotiations off track. North Korea has been clear that it's a two-way street, that they have already taken unilateral actions to stop testing, etc., and they need for the U.S. to take some concrete steps, whereas these ultra-militaristic forces who do not desire peace, who do not want this negotiations and any kind of agreement to go forward, are just demanding that North Korea, that everything is on North Korea's side, that North Korea make concession after concession with nothing from the U.S. And that's exactly what has thrown the prior agreements off track, is that both the North and the U.S. make agreements to do things, and then the U.S. doesn't hold up their side of the offer. So of course North Korea has to withdraw. Of course North Korea can't continue if all concessions are demanded just from their side. They need the U.S. to take concrete steps because, of course, it is the U.S. government that is primarily and predominantly responsible for all of the militarism and tensions and threats of war on the peninsula.
And in a way, also provocative comments. For example, few days ago, in Israel, Donald Trump's lawyer, we're talking about Rudolph Giuliani, has said, and again I quote, Kim Jong-un begged Trump on his knees to revive the summit, which is exactly the position you want to put him in. That's not really very diplomatic in order to create a good faith in order to going ahead with the summit. Is that what, a strategy?
Right, yes, it may be the strategy. Unfortunately, North Korea has demanded and continually restated that they should come to the table as equal partners, that they should be shown respect just like any other country, sovereign country, with a leadership would be shown in normal diplomatic sort of instances. But unfortunately, North Korea, for decades now, has been treated with nothing but demonization, racism, a complete lack of respect, which has been part of helping to prepare the U.S. population for war, which is something that the continued administrations have been preparing for and threatening. And so there's been this constant need to demonize, to belittle, to racistly undermine the country and the government and the leadership there. Hopefully behind closed doors, some respect will be shown so that the parties can actually talk about these extremely, important issues that affect the livelihoods and the futures and the just basic family relationships that exist between Koreans in the North and the South.
It seems that the issue here, or the key issue here, is what each part could understand behind the word denuclearization. The U.S. is trying to paint the picture that they are going to achieve, that the North Koreans are going to put aside completely their nuclear program. The North Koreans get the sense that denuclearization means the denuclearization of the whole Korea Peninsula. Is that what you're reading too?
Yeah, absolutely. For North Korea, denuclearization is sort of partly their role, partly South Korea's role, and partly the U.S. government's role. It was the U.S. government that originally introduced nuclear weapons to the peninsula, and of course the presence of tens of thousands of U.S. troops on the DMZ, the continued practice between the U.S. and South Korea of carrying out annual war games that actually sort of enact the nuclear annihilation of the North and all-out nuclear war is the real kind of threat to peace. And North Korea has developed nuclear weapons really as an issue of self-defense. And I think they've made it clear, just like the majority of people in the world, they would prefer not to have nuclear weapons. The majority of the people in the world want to live in a nuclear-free world without the threat of nuclear war. It's really just from the Pentagon, from the U.S. government that wants to maintain this gigantic nuclear arsenal that they can use as a threat against the whole world. And because of the existence of that gigantic nuclear arsenal, the rest of the world has to do something to try to defend themselves. And I mean, the reality is that if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, the U.S. may have gone to war with them. And in fact, they have been a deterrent in that sense. And so, I think they say, we too, as U.S. anti-war activists, believe that denuclearization must begin with the United States, because the United States has the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, and despite talks of denuclearization, they've committed over $1 trillion to the modernization of their nuclear weapons program. They're the only country to have used nuclear weapons, and they regularly, even more so with the Trump administration, continue to threaten their use. So it's, completely sort of turning everything upside down to act as if the main onus is on North Korea, when of course it's on the U.S. government. But North Korea is willing to take steps. They've already taken steps. They've already ended testing. They destroyed their test site. They've taken concrete steps. So, the U.S. absolutely has to do something, as does South Korea, because that's where the real threat to peace lies.
And if you have to make a forecast in this very first meeting, what do you think they're going to accomplish?
Well, it's very hard to predict, of course, with Trump and with the various forces at play, but hopefully they can come forward with a written agreement. Of course, these agreements have occurred before. have existed a number of times over the past 20 years, and unfortunately they haven't been followed through on, but they actually can sort of lay the groundwork if that is what the parties desire, because the concrete steps have already been laid out. And really what is needed is for a back and forth, for a written agreement that the North has already taken steps, that the U.S. and South Korea will take additional steps, and it will go forward. And ultimately, what's needed, what's in the media mostly is denuclearization. But the kind of big picture of what's needed for North Korea is, one, the end of sanctions that have done so much to harm the country economically for so many decades, and they need a peace treaty because, of course, there's only an armistice agreement now for 65 years, no peace treaty ending the Korean War, and that's really the kind of legal and underlying basis for so much of this threat of war and war tension and the presence of U.S. troops on the DMZ, on the peninsula. And so there has to be a peace treaty signed between the U.S., North Korea, and South Korea so that there can be an official end to war.
After 65 years.
After 65 years, the U.S. must withdraw its troops from the South. They must end the war games with South Korea. They need to do these things, and they need to allow the North and the South to continue on a self-determined path towards reunification, which is what both those governments desire and what 80 million Koreans in the North, South, and the diaspora desire. The U.S. has been the primary roadblock to reunification, and so what they need is for the U.S. to get out of the way. And physically that means withdrawing its troops, withdrawing its warships, getting out of the land, the sea, and the air with its not just nuclear weapons, but with its military in general.
And where is China in all this?
Well, it's somewhat yet to be determined. There's certainly a possibility of a four-party meeting, which could be significant. China, has played, in some senses, a positive role in offering some support to the North, but that could go either way in a sense, because, of course, the U.S. views China as a strategic competitor. China has not wanted to have a sort of complete break and conflict with the U.S. over North Korea, but they also desire to, move forward and grow economically to maintain more political, economic, and strategic independence, and that may make them more open to being more of an ally and partner to North Korea, which of course they need. They've been so isolated internationally because of the dominance of the U.S. in international politics. So there's certainly a perspective for them to kind of play a positive role in moving towards peace. Of course, it's in the interest of all countries in Northeast Asia for there to be a move towards peace and to end this threat of war that's been so prevalent in that part of the continent.
Subjects. G7 in Canada. And even before starting the summit, it has been called already the G6 plus the U.S. because of the tariffs war. What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting development in world politics because, of course, the U.S. government has sort of so handily dominated all international institutions and meetings and bodies for so many decades that now to be in this situation where Canada, where these Western European countries are in sharp disagreement with the U.S. And are standing up to them. The U.S. government has just asserted itself as this sort of unilateral superpower in the world and said everyone else must be their junior partners. And now the governments in those countries are standing up and saying, we're not just going to be walked all over. We're not just going to be your junior partners. And they have major objections, obviously, on economic issues, which will primarily be what's taken up there. And of course, they have big disagreements with the U.S. on climate, environment, also on Iran. And the continuation of the nuclear deal. So it seems like there's going to be sort of a level of tension and isolation for the U.S. government that they haven't experienced until this more recent period.
We're talking also that they're calling those leaders of mostly Canada and the Western leaders, they're calling the tariffs. We're talking about tariffs against aluminum and steel, unacceptable, illegal, and the New York Times just finished to publish an article that said, at the end of the day, those tariffs are going to end up hurting the U.S. economy?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, there's been a whole series of international agreements where, the U.S. has kind of asserted that all aspects of the agreement must be in their interest, going back to NAFTA, to CAFTA, to the U.S.-Korea trade, all these free trade agreements. They've wanted all the concessions on the other side and all the benefits on their side, much like sort of how some of these denuclearization talks go. And so this is a slightly new development for these countries to, not accept this, what's been sort of part of most of these past or more recent international trade agreements. They're, of course, also capitalist, imperialist countries. They're not necessarily operating in the interests of the majority of their own people either. They're not sort of the kind of great saviors or extremely progressive forces. But in terms of world politics, it's certainly a positive development for them to be standing up to the U.S., to not let the country be just kind of completely bled out, like what happened when the U.S. government forced Mexico, to make so many concessions on trade issues in NAFTA that had such a devastating effect on the economy, on farmers, on the general population. At least these countries are, have some kind of level of power to assert themselves and say, we're not just going to allow our countries to be kind of bled out in U.S. interest. So we'll see how it plays out because, of course, generally for the United States, military threats follow economic threats, but they're not as used to being in a situation where they're going head-to-head with other imperialist countries.
Well, precisely. If you just watch a history, the two world wars started with economic trouble, with economic wars. So do you think that the fact that Donald Trump is, in a way, exacerbating wars, trade wars, or his rhetoric through tweets, is creating, in terms of the world, what sort of climate, what sort of atmosphere?
Yeah, well, it could, in a sense, it could go both ways. So yes, the prospect of a sort of World War III is more present when there's rivalry between the imperialist countries, right? That was what happened in World War I and II. All the colonial powers, went to war with each other basically because they had divided up the planet, and then there was nothing left to divide, so they had to fight each other for it. So it's the potential for a third world war, the basis for that is rivalry between imperialist countries. Unlike the wars that we've been experiencing the past few decades, which is the U.S. government going after, countries trying to assert any kind of sovereignty, but who are unmatched militarily. This is a different situation, which is, of course, a deterrent, the fact that these countries have more sort of built-up military and capacities to defend themselves. At the same time, if it doesn't go to that, there's a positive element in the reduction of the kind of power of the United States government. Since the Soviet Union was overthrown, the U.S. government has been this sole superpower in the world, able to just sort of carry out whatever they wanted unchecked on the international level. And so to the extent that other imperialist countries assert themselves, don't just function as junior partners who are willing to be walked over, it can kind of reduce that unilateral power the U.S. government has been yielding, which is partly what's allowed it to carry out so many wars of aggression against countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So in that sense, it can serve as something that could limit that sort of power and assertion.
Talking about the possibility of war and tensions around the world, we're talking about the Middle East now, and the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran. What do you think is going to be the next step with the other partners without the U.S.? Is it going to continue, or what you believe that may eventually may be the scenario?
Well, the other signers to the deal have indicated, and this has been another source of tension between the U.S. and the European countries. They've criticized the U.S. actions, and they've encouraged Iran to continue, and they've stated their desire for this deal to continue. The U.S. can't technically withdraw, but what they've done is violated the agreement by saying that they're going to impose sanctions, which they're prohibited to do under the agreement. And so that's the kind of other element to the challenge, is that if the U.S. imposes sanctions, they've made it clear they're going to go after European countries that violate those sanctions. So even if they remain committed to staying in the deal and continuing with the terms of the deal, the U.S. will further try to undermine that by, in effect, sanctioning these European countries too, by preventing them from carrying out trade, which is what they've done in other cases where the U.S. has a unilateral sanctions or blockade. They threaten other countries to cut them off with trade with the U.S. if they trade with Cuba or whatever country is at issue. So that's kind of the bigger danger, is even if the other parties continue to operate within the framework, the U.S. has this economic leverage over them. But of course, really, in terms of the breakup of this deal, they're only supported by Israel, and by some of the Persian Gulf states who are, just completely kind of in the pocket of, this kind of scheme between the U.S. and Israel and these small monarchies who want to control all of the resources and dominate their land. So it's hard to tell what will happen. The U.S. has a significant amount of leverage when it comes to levying sanctions against a country, but they don't seem to have other allies within those who are signers to the deal in terms of its actual destruction. So there's still potential for it, to continue and for the other countries to find a way. Of course, Iran was already committed and had committed even prior to the signing of this agreement to a lot in terms of inspections, not building up their nuclear program, et cetera. But it still, of course, was a positive development to have all the parties come to the table and to have some concessions on the part of the U.S. and the European countries who have just targeted Iran ceaselessly for so long.
The reputation, according to the human rights organizations of Saudi Arabia and Israel, they have awful records of human rights. And the U.S. is preaching that is defending democracy, principles, human rights, and Saudi Arabia and Israel are the main allies and partners of the region. What is the message that they're talking about the morals of the U.S. dealing with those countries that mostly are ready to attack and to defamate Iran on a regular basis?
Right. Well, the just complete hypocrisy of the U.S. government going around the world and asserting that it's acting in the interest of democracy, of peace, of human rights, and that goes back decades. It goes back to World War II when the U.S., even though they were really fighting for the colonial redivision of Asia, claimed they were fighting the Nazis when at home there was segregation and Jim Crow apartheid that existed within the United States. So every time the U.S. does this decade after decade, the hypocrisy based on how they act here at home is overwhelmingly clear. And of course now Israel has been exposed more than ever. More and more people see the reality of how Israel behaves. They're carrying out basically weekly massacres of Palestinian people, which is exposing more and more to those who didn't know before the conditions that exist in Gaza, which is basically the world's biggest open-air prison. And so, for this to be the only partner that the U.S. has also trying to come in, and preach about human rights is, of course, completely absurd. Every time the U.S. brings up human rights, that it's a cover for something else. This is how they talk about North Korea, it's how they talk about China historically, it's how they talk about Cuba. They always want to talk about human rights or political prisoners, when, of course, progressive people in the United States know the U.S. government doesn't care at all about the rights of people within their own country or abroad. This, of course, is all based on their kind of economic and political interests to dominate and control all of these different countries, have puppet governments in place, control the land, control the resources, dominate the people. That's what all of this is about. All kind of other excuses, whether they're about human rights or terrorism, to the contrary. So of course it's just completely hypocritical, and I think more and more people see that as economic conditions in the United States worsen, as police brutality worsens and just becomes more exposed for everyone to see, and the fact that the U.S., these are the only allies the U.S. can get.
30 seconds. What do you think about the presidency of Trump? And is he going to finish his mandate?
Well, that's definitely anyone's guess. He appears extremely isolated. amongst so many different kind of sectors of the ruling class. But at the same time, it's quite a challenge to remove him from office. So I think that's yet to be seen, and I think the best thing we can do is, like what the Korean people are doing, is just put pressure on this administration just like we would put pressure on any administration to kind of meet the demands that the people have.
Senator Sloan, thanks very much for joining
Thank
us.
you.